And we can say hello to Deepika Laurent. Good to see you.
Hi, Delano.
You're starting out with a report from the Times of London about a prison over in Syria holding 5,000 ISIS fighters.
That's right. And the conditions described by the Times correspondent Anthony Lloyd, the conditions are horrific. He traveled to this northern Syrian prison run by the West Syrian Kurdish allies, describing it essentially as a ticking time bomb. There it is on the front page of the Times. That's a picture of the inmates there. 5,000 Islamic State group fighters being held there indefinitely until they have some sort of trial. Another 7,000 are housed in 6 other prisons nearby. We're talking about French, British, American, Belgians among them, crammed in like sardines, lying side by side. A number of them have already died through illness. There's no real medical care. There's no legal protection. Rage and listlessness really abounding in this prison. And scariest of all, it's not really policed very well. So you have boys as young as 12 who are being put in who are alongside some of the most hardened jihadists. And this writer says, like the way that ISIS was born out of the US-run camps in Iraq during the early 2000s, he's warning that we may be creating a new generation of jihadists and really taking to task Western countries who prefer to turn a blind eye, keep them there rather than actually create an international tribunal or actually repatriate them.
Indeed, a ticking time bomb is the best way to describe it. Now, tomorrow, the October 2nd, marks 1 year since Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist, was dismembered at a Saudi consulate over in Istanbul.
That's right. A year on, despite everything we've learned about Jamal Khashoggi and how he died, his killers haven't been brought to justice. And to quote this writer from the Pan-Arab Al Arabi newspaper, it seems to, quote, matter painfully little. It's also the focus of today's editorial by the Washington Post. The Washington Post, the paper for whom Jamal Khashoggi was a columnist. The Post explains that he never really intended to be a dissident. He left the Saudi kingdom after a sharp increase in domestic repression and then made it his task to challenge the crown prince, for instance, on the war on Yemen, saying it was unwinnable. He also frequently warned the Saudi regime that persecuting activists would backfire on them. And the Washington Post says, a year after his death, he's right. The Saudi regime has been, quote, universally vilified by human rights groups. The crown prince is pretty much a pariah in most of the West. And Saudi is less secure because of the war in Yemen. We just need to look at the most recent drone strikes on the Saudi oil facility.
Moving on now, this month marks 2 years since the Me Too movement exploded, urging women to speak up about sexual abuse.
And USA Today is looking at it on its front page, Delano. They're looking at it specifically to see if the movement has really evolved beyond just a hashtag to deliver real change. And basically the results, at least in the U.S., are mixed. On one hand, you have men like Brett Kavanaugh and Donald Trump who faced accusations of sexual assault but were never really brought to justice or investigated for it. But Larry Nassar, the former USA gymnastics team doctor, he's probably the most high-profile case of being held accountable for his actions. He got life in prison. R. Kelly was finally charged with federal sex crimes as well. So there are some good, there are some bad. The movement, USA Today says, has brought decreased stigma and increased awareness, but it still has a lot to do when it comes to things like justice and accountability, particularly for women of lower income and women of color. Now, the New York Magazine has published a long feature looking at the toll of the Me Too movement on those who spoke out. You know, we talk about the details of the attacks. We talk about the men, but what about the women who sacrifice a lot to come forward and speak? The repercussions for them are devastating.
Like Christine Blasey Ford.
Exactly. We're talking isolation, loneliness, guilt, shame, further abuse, insult. And also when it comes to speaking out about workplace harassment, often there's a big discussion about whether the perpetrators can get their jobs back. But in many cases, the women who speak out don't get rehired.
Indeed. Now, moving on to Qatar, where the World Athletics Championships are going on, and they're making headlines for all the wrong reasons.
That's right. Empty seats, suffocating heat that caused some of the athletes to even be hospitalized, stadiums that were at quarter capacity for some of the most thrilling races. For The Guardian's writer, Doha's staging of the World Athletics Championships tells a tale of corruption, warped priorities, and vested interests. But if you read the Qatari press, all is going really, really well. It's running fantastic. fantastically well. In fact, the Gulf Times sports front page is looking at how Qatar is now looking to put its bid for the 2030 Asian Games. I quote, supported by a high-energy presentation capturing the thriving sports movement in the country.
Indeed, a thriving sports movement. Finally from you, Dipti, an incredible story of a little boy who accidentally won an adults running event.
Yeah, I can barely accidentally finish an adults running event, but this kid won it. This took place in Minnesota earlier this month. His name is Cade Lovell. He's 9, by the way. So he was taking part in the 5-kilometer race, and his mom, understandably, got very worried when he didn't cross the finish line. It turns out that he misunderstood some directions during the event and ended up running in a separate 10-kilometer race. Not only that, he actually won the race, beating out his 40-year-old second-place contestant. He ran the race. He ran the 10 kilometers in 48 minutes. His mom says he was probably so panicked that he was running really, really fast.
Oh, that's a good story. Thank you very much for that, Dipti. Diptika Lohon there with the press review, and you can track other editions of our press review on our website. The address is france24.com.